Welcome to our Meet the Author series, as Tamsin said. I'm Carrie Dixon, Managing Editor for Books at Common Ground Research Networks. And today, in conjunction with our Arts and Society Conference, we are here to learn more about Patricia Reinheimer's book, Olly, Race, Class, and Gender in the Invention of a Rustic Modernity. Patricia Reinheimer is a professor in the Department of Social Sciences at the Federal Rural University of Rio de Janeiro. Her undergraduate degree is in art education, and her master's and doctorate degrees are in social anthropology. So this winner of this year's Common Grounds Publishers Prize, it weaves the threads of family history, artistic innovation, and cultural politics to explore the creative realm of the author's grandmother, Olly Reinheimer. So emerging in the 1960s, Olly Reinheimer's creative and material work blended weaving and other techniques, and such as sewing, painting, embroidery, and engraving. And collectively, these material and process choices informed and reflected a style in art and fashion that became associated with modernity, tropical nature, feminine sensuality, and Brazilianness. So throughout the 1970s, Olly's work gained notoriety and was shown in museums and modern art galleries in Brazil and across Latin America. So through this really richly detailed and intimate, yet really incisive and critical look at Olly Reinheimer's art, the book identifies the emergence of an artistic sensibility, and this sensibility was intended to be universal, even though it was produced and consumed by a certain white middle-class audience. So through research structured from multiple perspectives, Patricia Reinheimer unearths the complex ways that gender, race, and class are crafted, represented, reinterpreted, codified in the life and work of her grandmother, Olly Reinheimer. It also highlights, and this is one of my favorite aspects, the role of collecting in the constitution of decorative and domestic spaces, and provides a feminist reading of the role that textile production and decorative arts play in design institutionalization in Brazil. So with all of that, I will hand things over to Dr. Reinheimer to tell you more about this really interesting book.
Thank you very much, Carrie and Tamsin. It's very nice to be here. I thank you all for the presence, and I already apologize. I will be reading to stay within our time frame, and so we can synchronize images and texts. Good afternoon to everybody. I had prepared closed captions for a video I made to present the book in two congresses, Sociology and an Anthropology Congress last year, but I decided not to show it. It is in YouTube, and I am putting here the link to it, so you can access later to see some more of the research, some more images. I will show other images and I'll talk about the research itself and some of the book's content. The initial intent to do the research that led to the book came up as soon as I returned to Brazil after 5 years living abroad from 1990 to 95. I came back to Brazil to live in Olly and Werner's apartment that I knew since I was born. Olly had died in 1986 and Werner in 1992. They were my grandparents. Having lived abroad during this period had two major impacts on me. First, a change in my social identity. I saw myself transformed from a white middle-class woman into a foreigner, Latin American or Brazilian, depending on the context, with all the racial and sexual stereotypes that it implies. This made me realize that being white was neither a given nor an objective condition. I gradually systematized the sentiment after my entry into the master's degrees program. The second important dimension was that I arrived in the apartment where the couple lived 3 years after Werner's death and 9 years after Olly's. By that time, the intensity of the grief had already dispersed. With the dispersal of this mourning, I could be dazzled by the things I found or rediscovered in this apartment. It was no longer the pain of loss, at least not only, but also the ecstasy of the beauty, the wonder, and the awe, the amount and quality of the things the apartment had that caught my attention. Drawers, attic, infinite spaces that surprised me until the very last day in the apartment in March 2020. 30 years after their passing, I was still finding things. The impact of the multiplicity, diversity, beauty, and mystery of these things on me and on others who always talked about the things, the banana tree in the living room, the string books, the pre-Columbian ceramics, was in part what prompted me to do this research. Reading about the possibility that things have to make us do things was essential to understand that the book was about the things and their impact on the institution of new values, new relationships, and new aesthetics. I draw attention to the noun institution rather than construction. The term is part of a set of categories used by authors who have worked with the attempt to institute an epistemology that is not founded on two separate dimensions, nature and culture, as different and contradictory things. The implications of ecological epistemologies are seeking to question the separation of human experience of the world in the world itself from its objective existence and knowledge of that world. Among these authors, there is a certain consensus in dealing with art as a knowledge as legitimate as any other in the humanities. We can look for the beginning of these reflections or the beginning of the incorporation of artistic expressions within the context of legitimacy of forms of knowledge production to the American anthropologist George Marcus in the 90s. He questioned whether the arts would not be a better way of evoking the complexities experienced in this research field. One of the debates is the idea of the representation of reality versus the evocation of certain conditions, sensations, and reflections that the relationships established in the search arouse, bring, allow, or pose. Behind it is the questioning of an out there versus the idea of a subjectivity that is part of a world within, and the challenge of not separating an outside from an inside that can be translated into various other dualities, such as objective versus subjective, public versus private, female versus male, work versus leisure, and so on. Two strategies that I activated from this idea of evocation were, first, I reestablished contact with various artistic expression techniques that had been part of my childhood. Most of the first 19 years of my life, I spent in this apartment with my grandparents, experimenting with woodcuts, painting, sculpture, ceramics, drawing, literature, and so on. A world which was abandoned as soon as I got into the master program in 2000. If I was going to talk about this world, I wanted my body to remember what this world did to me. How did my perception change if I am looking at something in order to draw, to paint, or to describe it in a text? The second strategy was to seek a text production workshop. I found a workshop that talked about encouraging writing with your heart at your fingertips. My intention with it was to overcome academic writing and the idea of objectivity that it presupposes. I was willing to produce with pleasure, with love, and with pain. I was going to talk about grief, suffering, longing, admiration, love, and I wanted it all to be felt from reading the text. I suppose I succeeded on some passages and I did not on others. I really wanted my subjectivity to be in the text, not as a value judgment, but as affection, style, and criticism. The end of the third chapter, actually the first to be written, I did it in the room where I veiled Olly's still warm body. Even today, every time I write about it, my eyes get teary. I read several things about grief. I read books related to the search of Jewish origins, the suffering of ancestors, and ways to share this experience. I read about the way people use these things and express them in their text as a way of elaborating affection, feelings, and pain. So far, I have been talking about an ideal world and an abstract research that would have allowed me to start by investigating the objects and the apartment as this space that contained and exposed the things Olly and Werner collected to the eyes of a mesh of relationships. However, the ideal only exists in our heads. So none of this happened in that order. There was an after-the-fact rationalization that I have achieved while preparing this presentation. I started the research from another place, reconstruction reconstructing these two characters' trajectory to understand how they collected the things they did, how they lived in this apartment, and before that in other places. I started there because in part, Werner was born in 1912 and Olly in 14, and the people they met were either very old or dead. So there was an urgency to start there. Two last methodological comments I think are important before we go on. First, about the types of things that led to the research. Talking about the kinds of things means talking about different kinds of materialities that differentially impacted the research. In the image we see, things stuffed as they were before the project, although some have already been sorted into folders by Olly or others who lived in the apartment. What were those things? Photos, letters, resumes, ceramic pieces, paintings, artistic objects, wood, fabric, optical devices. Investigating these things involved understanding how and when they entered Olly's life. Understand the exchange circuits they went through and understand what values and meanings they had when they entered and how those meanings transformed over time. The apartment itself was seen as something in transformation that contributed to the change in their trajectory. The apartment is part of a broad circuit of values and meanings that has an impact on people's lives. The place where Olly and Werner's apartment is located, Ipanema, was in the 60s the cultural center of Rio de Janeiro. The fact that the apartment was neither exactly public nor exactly private was something I discovered during the research. One of the ways to deal with the profusion of things was to hire librarians and a fashion PhD student who had already organized a museological collection to systematize, classify, and list each of these things. So we created some classifications, partially based on Olly's organization and partially arbitrarily assigned by me or suggested by others. After Olly's death, things had lost part of their original organization given by her due to the displacement of things done by the apartment's residents, her husband, her son, her youngest grandson, and myself. Over 30 years, people who lived in the apartment had relocated things, thrown away, distributed, sold, broken, or lost stuff. This is therefore in this process also in this process also a dimension of values invention and an invention of the characters themselves by the interest on the part of this granddaughter and anthropologist. The second methodological observation is about this couple who are not treated as a couple. There are several researches on immigrant couples, anthropologist couples, artists couples. My interest was not in the couple because this approach seems largely to subsume the women's role into the role of wives. Women end up being so-and-so's wife. The most emblematic case of this is that of Dinah Lévi-Strauss, who for years was known only as Mrs. Lévi-Strauss. But that wasn't the case either, as only Olly was an artist. That is, it wasn't a couple of artists or a couple of political activists or a couple of immigrants. Although the two had been immigrants from Germany, they only met in Brazil. However, I did not want to hide Werner. His political interests certainly impacted her choices. They were married for nearly 50 years. Her artistic choices also had an impact on the establishment of his relationships network that were greater than the context of a political party. Therefore, they impact on each other's reputation. The apartment's library, as well as the collection of pre-Columbian ceramics displayed on the same bookshelf where the library was located, was therefore a privileged place to observe many of her thematic choices. The photographs of this apartment throughout the 60s, 70s, and 80s showed Olly's growing recognition, how she was gradually conquering both a personal and a professional reputation, or a career towards recognition by her peers and also her family. I also wanted the story to be told from the social context in which this artist lived and not from a trajectory of a brilliant artist, a genius. I wanted it to be presented as a product of the context. I didn't want to give things the weight of final products. I wanted to show the processes behind this character, behind the thematic choices, the meshes of relationships, and the very relationships of their acquaintances with the subjects in force at the time. So some subjects were important as a setting within which her thematic choices were made. Feminism, for example, or national identity appeared as a striking way. In order to not to speak of a brilliant artist who produced incredible objects, even though I do consider the objects she produced incredible, understanding the context and her mesh of relations was the way to speak about her procedurally. For that, I had to assume what Alfred Gell calls methodological philistinism, that is, assume an attitude, the aesthetic value of the things she produced. This is very different from saying that I have no admiration for her production, quite the opposite. But it means not letting my personal feelings be used to criticize or to support the aesthetic judgments made by her peers at the time. These were some of the methodological considerations for the research construction. Several Brazilian research institutions sponsored the project along 6 years. This happened before the political coup that led us to the intellectual desert in the state administration we are experiencing today. The book talks about now. The book talks about how, through things organized and classified for donation, it was possible to see a network of relationships formed most by immigrants and immigrants' descendants that appropriated the productions of peripheral groups in the invention of accessibility notion that, even though treated as universal, it concerned only white, middle, and upper middle class consumers. The period analyzed was mainly the 60s, but to get there, I reconstructed Werner and Olly's trajectory, passing through the pogroms in Europe from Odessa, which was in Russia and today is located in Ukraine, passing through Nazism in northern and southern Germany, bordering France, where Olly and Werner respectively lived. I looked at the 30s and their arrival in Brazil amid a government that supported Germany and that shortly after allied with the US and began to persecute Germans. Only then I reached the 60s, which is when the country was plunged into a civil military dictatorship in which German, Jewish, and communist adjectives complicated this man and this couple's position, to say the least. These contexts helped to understand the liminal and ambiguous position of this white middle-class couple with good educational background, but without freedom of expression and movement within Brazilian society. The urbanization of Rio de Janeiro throughout the 50s, and especially the growth of buildings in Ipanema and Copacabana, brought an atmosphere of appreciation of modernity represented by home appliances and cars, but at the same time, a longing for the memory of tradition and folklore. Between 47 and 64, there were a series of congresses to discuss folklore. Luiz Rodolfo Vilhena published his thesis showing how these congresses outlined the clash between folklorists and anthropologists in an attempt to define folklore and as an academic discipline, which ended up not happening. It was also in that decade, precisely in 1952, the opening of the Museu do Índio, Indigenous Groups Museum in Rio de Janeiro, designed by Darcy Ribeiro. Ribeiro, like Noel Nuttels, were part of the couple's relationship mesh. Nuttels was a Jewish Ukrainian immigrant, a sanitarian, who was president of the SPI, the Service for the Indians Protection. Ribeiro was married to Berta Gleiser, a Romanian Jewish immigrant, Brazilian naturalized. Both were anthropologists, and Berta wrote about indigenous feather adornments, a book that is in Olly's library. I spoke about urbanization and the couple's relationship with anthropologists who worked with indigenous groups to talk about the impact of the context and their mesh of relationships on Olly's artistic thematic choices and the impact of these themes on the construction of her posterity by Rio de Janeiro's Museum of Modern Art. It is possible to see that there was the construction of a reputation by exalting Rio's MoMAs as the place for her training process through her resumes, through the resumes she left. In her curricula, she appears as having completed her entire training at Rio's MoMA, when it opened art ateliers, not only for training artists, but also for training an art-loving public. Olly had a background prior to the one she leaves registered in her resumes. This previous training was erased, most likely because the previous courses would be considered craft or sewing and did not contribute to building a reputation and a recognition as an artist. She probably got rid of the traces of these courses and left only the courses attending at Rio's MoMA. This museum, located on an avenue called United Nations, represented the very modernity that in Brazil was a coexistence of folklore with the speed and design in the sense of furniture design, jewelry design, graphic design, and clothing design. At that time, the actors who were trying to institutionalize design in Brazil, which included Olly and some of her acquaintances, triggered clothing as a way to support other types of design. Nevertheless, in Brazil, only in the 90s, fashion design was institutionalized as part of the designer's university training. There were two specific and different groups that defended this design institutionalization process. One based on the idea of universality of technique close to Bauhaus style, and the other based on regionalisms and folklore for the production of a popular culture as a way to particularize Brazilian design. Olly had acquaintances in both groups, and one of the ways to observe how these two ideas manifested themselves in people's daily lives was to see how interior decoration was organized at the time, especially from the artist's apartment. Olly held her first solo exhibition in 1958 at the art gallery of the furniture store owned by an English designer called Norman Westwater. At the time, the furniture store separated spaces to exhibit contemporary artists' production. They were important spaces for the presentation of new styles. Next, she exhibited her work at the Rio de Janeiro MoMA at the invitation of Niomar Mudin Sodré, the museum's director. This exhibition was shown also at the Curitiba and Salvador MoMAs. The later at the invitation of the designer and museum director, Lina Bobardi. Lina was Pietro Marias Bardi's wife, director of the São Paulo Museum of Art, owned by Gilberto Assis Chateaubriand, who also owned Diários Associados Media Conglomerate. It is important to know this as there was a growing process of publicizing the artists who were building this modernity and this modern art-loving public in Brazil. Niomar was married to the owner of another newspaper, Diário da Noite, in Rio de Janeiro. Participation in the press world was very important. Those two who invited Olly to exhibit, Norman Westwater and Lina Bobardi, were each one representative of one of those design strands previously mentioned. Norman was a more internationalist and Bauhaus kind of designer, and Lina was a more regionalist one. Bardi and other art and museum professionals organized themselves to institutionalize design as an area of professional activity and with higher education. That's how Superior School of Industrial Design emerged in the 60s with some professionals who also worked at the Rio's MoMA. In 67, Karl-Heinz Bergmüller, who had been a teacher at Ulm School, was the organizer of Olly's second solo exhibition at Rio MoMA in 69. He had come to Rio to work at Rio MoMA and to establish in the museum the Industrial Design Institute, which never happened. but he ended up organizing with Norman Westwater the first design biennial in Brazil, Industrial Design 68. In the 60s, clothing was one of the spheres of production that contributed to a discourse in support of the institutionalization of design in Brazil. Olly was an accumulator, not in the pathological sense, but in the sense of constituting collections of meaning. There is an anecdote that circulates in the family that tells that one day she arrived home with a pole in which a straw mat was wrapped and in it several pinwheels was stuck. When asked why she bought all the pinwheels, she would have replied that a single one didn't make sense. It is interesting to think about this idea of the lack of meaning in a unity and the aesthetics and meaning of quantity, which talks about the visual appeal that the set has, but also about the perception that the meaning of quantity was different than that of a unity. In organizing her things then, it was possible to identify some different collections: pre-Columbian, indigenous, folklore, popular culture objects, modern production, producers bordering the contemporary, magazines collections, National Geographic, UNESCO, Polish children's drawings, and so on. It seems interesting to mention that I researched Olly in my first university degree in artistic education. I took her resumes and reconstructed part of her artistic formation. I mentioned this to draw attention to the time it took me to realize that all the other things were as important to think about her trajectory as a result of one single place where she claimed to have studied. I used the apartment photos to see how the organization of the space was changing over time and how this organization inside the apartment became a way of presenting her own reputation. It is important to remember how in the 60s, with the Brazilian dictatorship, people's homes became important spaces for meeting and debates that were taboo in public. Some of the people interviewed said that it was very common to go to a restaurant and suddenly find that people were watching, staring, and censoring the conversations. In the period, Ipanema is known for having had several intellectuals who organized meetings in their homes to discuss art, politics, and others. It was then based on these collections and organization of domestic spaces that I interpreted the institution of what I called a white middle class sensibility founded on working with raw materials, wood, rural groups, and the appropriation of things produced by indigenous groups, pageants, and so on. These groups from whom things were appropriated were not consumers of the final products and did not even appear as producers of what was based on their production, that is on the product of these ethnic and cultural loans. There was a process of invisibility of peripheral groups, and the producers who were influenced by these loans were the ones who appeared as original creators. The English professor Peter Stallybrass uses Karl Marx's quote in the 19th century to talk about an economy of affections related to our society's relationship with things. I take advantage of his reflections to think about the apartment that is now empty, waiting to be sold. It was stripped of its stories and transformed into a commodity. It lost part of its use value to be evaluated only by its exchange value. It was stripped of its particularities to enter the condition of merchandise. The possibility that history, memory, and desire can be materialized in objects was realized by the publication of the book Olly, Race, Class, and Gender in the Invention of a Rustic Modernity. That apartment is now only in my memory and in this book. So I thank Common Ground, especially through those I have had contact with over the past few years. Philip Calancis-Cope, Carrie Dixon, Ryan Rogers, Tamsin Gilbert, and in the beginning, Felipe Kisubica. And I thank you all for being here today. I hope the accent was good enough to understand what I spoke.
It was a wonderful presentation, and as always, stunningly theoretically informed and articulate. So I appreciate that. And if you enjoyed this presentation, that's very much the thoughtful and incredibly deep and personal and analytical tone of the book itself. So Tamsin, are we going to open things up for questions?
Yes, so we have some time for questions. If you have a question, you can raise your hand. Sorry, it's just taking me a minute to get everything off screen share and things like that. But if you have a question, you can write your question in the chat or write your name in the chat, or you could just raise your hand and give us a wave of some type. Mary, did you want to unmute yourself and ask your question? Are you there? Yeah.
Thank you. That was a very beautifully presented and captured everything I think you wanted to capture. But when I have a question, seeing all those wonderful artifacts, what's the relationship between collecting and creating for you and for Olly? I was just wondering what it was, and thank you for creating that archive of this magnificent period in your life and in their lives.
Should I answer right away or should we wait for right away?
Yeah,
great, good. Thank you for the question. Really, thank you, because I think it's not always is clear enough, this relationship between creation and collecting.
Yes.
She used many of the things she collected as an influence on her work. I'm looking at the book and trying to find some images. I don't know if you had the chance to see it, but she's got, for example, the cover itself. This is a textile she made, and all the strings are parts. So we can look at it and see, oh, it's badly finished, but it's not. It's a finish that she took from the pre-Columbian textiles.
Right.
So in many, or the designs in the pre-Columbian things, the pottery and the textiles, the birds, and many of the human designs, she used as a way to create things of her own. So she didn't copy the things, but she transformed into things that were hers. So sometimes the colors were appropriated, sometimes the way to finish the textiles, sometimes the way to stylize animals. So she was always looking at, or sometimes, or for example, I showed in the images that Tamsin was passing for you, some engravings on some wood engravings. She would use, those were used in string literature. That is literature that was made with string, handmade with wooden prints. And she would use those wooden prints to make patterns in the textiles to make clothing. So she used in many different ways to the things she collected as a reference to create things in her own clothing and in her own objects of decoration. She made clothing, she made textiles, she made clothing, and she made, with the textiles, decorating objects.
Right. And you, Patricia, you have made your tapestry out of what you've collected from her, memories and images and, and sensations. Would that also be a parallel?
Definitely. If you look at my house, many of the things I inherited from her are here, the atmosphere. So I lived in the apartment for 25 years, and some of the interviews were done in the apartment, and with people that met her, and most of them now, I had experiences of having interviewed the person, and like 3, 4 months later, somebody would call and say, you know, you're invited to the funeral of this person, because I interviewed someone that was 99 and someone that was 100 years old. But some of those people entered the apartment and they would, wow, I see that you changed a lot of things, but the atmosphere is the same. So I still have, you know, many of this seduction for the rustic, for the, you know, the raw, the work of the nature, as I would say, you know, this two images that I shown from a cabinet made of wood with all the knots and all the, you know, the work of the wood itself, the tree itself is part of things that I have today, not only in my life, but also not only in my house, but also in my life.
And just finally, I watched the video quickly while you were talking. I like your point that the dead are never past.
I'm not the one to say that. I only appropriate it from other authors who say that.
Very nice, very nice.
Yeah.
Thank you. The next question we have is from Bill. Bill, did you want to ask your question?
Yeah, I just, it's an interesting juxtaposition, you know, the modern and the rustic, and what a lot of, and so this is a kind of a philosophical question, a theoretical question about modernism, if you like. So, you know, modernism as an aesthetic is about, you know, the industrial, the straight up and down, the simple, the, you know, it's got a whole kind of aura to it as an aesthetic, and it's a kind of a celebration of what's new, whereas a lot of what modernism does, and you've got an illustration of this, is also referring back to the opposite, which might be called the primitive, right, which is, you know, pre-industrial, and actually not just immediately pre-industrial, going back to, you know, the beginnings of time, if you like, very, you know, ancient peoples who are reproducing ancient practices. So, I mean, I'm just wondering about this contradiction, which is both a kind of and this is just a general sort of philosophical question, if you like, about the way in which these things which are so different from each other and you would think should be antagonistic in relation to each other, and how do they sit together? What does that mean? And it's a common thing in modernism to link these things in this way, but how does it work?
Thank you, William, for your question. I think they mean different things. If we're talking from an European or North American perspective, or if we're talking about peripheral countries like Brazil. I think modernity as industrial, as speed, as technology, is a presupposition from Europe and North America and not from peripheral countries. So I think that from this perspective, the combination between modernity and rusticity or primitivism is a bit of what I said, the coexistence of seeing the future now, or seeing how the future will become each time more technologized, and also longing for what's going away. And I think that from the peripheral countries is a way to make an identity, or sometimes a national identity, sometimes a subjective identity, because it's not our prerogative, the technological modernization. So we have to found our modernity on other things. And the things we found on is on rusticity, primitivity, whatever. Olly has a saying in this exhibition that she showed in 1969, what she actually appropriated from, she was influenced by one of an indigenous Brazilian group, and actually she transformed the idea, they painting their faces and their bodies with three major colors, ochre, red, and black. And she took those body paintings and transformed into clothes that were very geometrical. Sorry, sometimes I have to think in Portuguese before saying something in English. And it's funny because then she gives an interview to a newspaper saying that she had 3 major collections in this exhibit. One was this one with geometrical things, and the other one was very colorful. One of the images shown there with very colorful, a woman sitting with a bare back, and other ones are from this exhibition. And she said it was based on the fauna and the tropical fauna and flora. And in the interview, she says, well, I prefer the ones based on the body paintings of the indigenous groups, because this is actually Brazilian. This is originally Brazilian, because fauna and flora, tropical fauna and flora, you find in many countries. But she made such a reading of the body paintings that you could not see. I found one of these dresses was found in the collection of movie producer in Brazil nowadays. Now, when I was starting the research, and my brother works in the movie industry in Brazil, and she found out that a friend of his that was working with dressings in wardrobe cinema had found this dress and had stolen the dress. And she got photographed with the dress in the commemoration of, I don't remember how many years, but the release of the 2001 movie. And so she was relating the dress to this very modern and technological, and not to the indigenous groups. So it all depends on, and if you take the image out of the context, you can read anything to it. So we read the modernity coexisting with its opposition primitivism, but actually it's just a discourse to create new things, I guess. I don't know if I answered your question, sorry.
The next question we have is from Dr. Dakin. Dr. Dakin, would you like to unmute yourself to ask your question, or would you like me to read your question?
Thank you. Patricia, I'm sorry for coming in late, but I had a commitment. But a question I have about this work, how has it influenced other research in this area? Or what would you say to bringing attention to this? And the reason I ask is my wife is from Colombia. We were married in Colombia. So I have a broad range of cultural influences in my own life. So I'm interested in hearing how you say this.
I'm sorry, I don't know if I understood the question, how my research would influence other researchers?
Yes, exactly.
I don't know. Well, what I see, because we can think about the several different areas of interest in the humanities. So I think that in anthropology, for example, in Brazil, there are very few anthropologists interested in modern art or Western art, if we may say it that way. But usually anthropologists are interested in, indigenous art or popular art or art done by minority groups. So there isn't a lot of anthropologists really interested in Western art. But I was invited by historians, art historians, to talk about the research because they saw it was a very different way to see and to organize the knowledge about the period, thinking about the influence of social sciences in the production, in the creative area in the 60s. I don't think I have ever seen this done. So more than expecting my research to influence others, I would be very surprised and in feel gratitude if it did in the future. I hope
The next question we have is from Michiko Aramaki. Forgive me if I'm not pronouncing that correctly. Michiko, did you want to ask your question?
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Reinham. It was very interesting. I really appreciated your presentation. And I'm just interested in your expression when you said sensibility and consumed by a certain white middle class audience. And I really note that your attention to the obviously the race issue and then the class issue, I'm really I really like that. And then I just wondered, in just thinking about the work by Sarah Ahmed, and then she has used extensively the concept of affect. And when you said sensibility, is that something to do with something comparable to the concept of affect that Sarah Ahmed would use, that is that can be attached, travel and transferable? And or if your term sensibility is not really comparable to her, would you like to explain to us what you mean by sensibility a little bit more? Thank you.
Thank you for a question, Ramaki. I don't really know this author that you mentioned. I would really like to get to know him or her. If you could send me the references later, I would try to look for it. So I cannot say that if I'm using something closer because I did not read it. But the idea of sensibility that I'm using, it's this idea of a universal sensibility that is usually talked about it, not as much today, but it was until very few years ago when we talked about sensibility. We would talk about someone that has sensibility or somebody that doesn't have sensibility, as if sensibility was something universal to a human race or to humans in general. And what I'm showing in the book is that exactly this idea, this universal idea of sensibility, is actually instituted, constructed, built to pose differences, to make groups different, more legitimate, to separate people from each other, groups from each other. And that's and it's always very difficult to pinpoint because everybody's always in the liminal state, always in the frontier. Some are more, some are less. No, blacks, gendered people are more commonly in the frontier, but even the higher classes of white heterosexual female or male are also sometimes put in a frontier and are made to realize. That's why I start the presentation saying how important it was to have lived abroad and to find myself as somebody that was seen in a point as white, or in another point or in another context seen as a foreigner, or Brazilian, or whatever. So I'm sorry if I don't know this author. I would really like to.
I will send you something, but your answer really is great. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Carrie, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I was going to say, I have some actually just fairly straightforward questions, I think. I was curious, just sort of, thinking about this process and the way you navigate in and among and between sort of the personal and the larger, be it anthropological or cultural or theoretical and political and social implications of everything that is familial and personal, right? And that's clearly one of the virtues, I would argue, of the project. So given all that, I was just curious, what was the family's reaction, and what was there a family reaction, or was this, oh, this is what you do? And also, what's the reception like in Brazil? Because I wouldn't have I come to it, not having the same sort of understanding until I read your work, of what some of these works might evoke, or what kind of appropriations are happening. So I'm wondering if the reception in Brazil has inflections that I might not be aware of sitting here in Illinois, in the US. So those are my questions.
Thank you, Carrie. I will start from the last question. I haven't read the book in Portuguese, so the book has a very little impact. The movie that I put in YouTube was shown in those two congresses, and it was very well received. People enjoyed very much. And every time I present, because over those 6 years of research, I presented many parts of the research in many different congresses and situations. And every time people were really interested by my work and amazed with Olly's work, because I do think that my grandmother's work is really incredible. The colors are great. I think she was very creative. And so it has an impact that it's not, a huge popular, and it's not big in the amount, but every time I present, everybody is really satisfied with the research and really amazed with her work. In the family, well, from the first time, everybody was really glad that I was doing something, because it was an apartment very full of stuff everywhere. We could barely walk around the apartment, and my father, who was Olly and Werner's son, and I were very reluctant in renting or thinking about selling the apartment, because we saw the value in it, the affectional value in it. But also I did see the historical value, the social value in it. I think my father did too. And so when I started doing the first research, and then the second, the first wasn't taken really serious because it was a graduate research, and people didn't, you can do a graduation in, I don't know, law, and then all of a sudden become a store seller. So they didn't expect many things. But when I started the research a few years ago in 1913, then they started, things started being given to me by the other people in family. But when I sent the text, the book text, before I even submitted to anybody, I think some of the reactions started to change. I mean, I became part of, a memory holder of the family, somebody at the same time, a little bit of envy, because I was a guardian of the memory, and I was building my reputation on my grandparents' story. And so at one point I was told that I was allowed to do the research with the family material, and I said, well, I'm doing it for everybody, not only for me. And if you don't want me to study this, there's no problem. I can study anything else. I'm an anthropologist. I'm studying this from an anthropology point of view. So and I think the apartment is empty now, and it's being sold now because of the research. In part, it was, people were a bit hurt because I did something with all of that, and I prepared everything so we could actually, transform the past into something new and not leave it for, as garbage.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. And I just suspect, sort of family relationships being what they are, that it's always layered and complicated, especially when there's loss and there's a past. Because even if you have informal family stories, depending on whose memory and their investment, they're radically different versions and interpretations. So I can only imagine something as tangibly and symbolically impactful for your family as this apartment, is now being kind of repurposed and repackaged into this book, and in some ways I think that's beautiful. And of course, in some ways, I'm sure it's wrenching, because that is representation of this passing, right? So
that after I emptied the apartment, I never went back there. I have no courage to see it.
Yeah.
I mean, my apartment is in the book.
Right. I mean, that's very much what I took from your description of the process. which I think is a testament to your process and also to the book. So again, I thank you. If there aren't any further questions, I guess we're almost at the time where we need to wrap this up. Is that true, Tamsin?